Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Sweet and Low, episode number 2. So as we prepare for, Be'ezrat Hashem, a sweet new year, the idea of these classes is to bring Torah profundity into the lowest common denominator. Not to get us into a low, but rather to bring holiness into every facet and arena of life. And the ultimate purpose and goal is not to get us down, but rather to uplift us. So in the previous episode, we talked about the words of the Torah with regard to the sounding of the shofar. That's a customary observance during the course of the entire month of Elul. The Torah explains this idea based on the teachings of Pirkei the Rebbe Eliezer. There we hear that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he ascended the mountain for the third time, this time to receive the second set of luchot and God's forgiveness, sounded the shofar. And then the Torah adds another detail. He said, just as we on Rosh Chodesh Elul sound the shofar, as if to indicate to people that we need to stop, think, and remember, and avoid the things that are toxic, but rather move in a more positive direction. The Torah then adds, he says, Lochein hiskinu chachameinu zechenu levracha. This is the reason that our sages of blessed memory instituted sheyiyu, taken bereish chedesh elul shebachol shana v'shana, each and every year. And then the Torah added the words, and we spoke about this in episode 1. This is the Torah in Siman Tov Kuf Pei Aleph, which is the beginning of Hilchos Rosh Hashanah, chapter 581 of the Orach Chaim section of Shulchan Aruch. And he says, the shofar continues to be sounded for the duration of the month, kedei lahazir Yisrael sheyasu tshuva, so that the Jewish people will be stirred, or maybe even sternly warned, that they should do tshuva. Shenemar, as it is written, im yitaka shofar be'ir va'am lo yecharod. A shofar will be sounded in the city, and the people won't tremble. That's supposed to be like read incredulously. The Beit Yosef famously asks, why do we have to add the pasuk ve'im yitoka? After all, we have a very good reason for the sounding of the shofar. And he says the reason for the sounding of the shofar, to commemorate Moshe Rabbeinu's sounding of a shofar, which is encapsulated by the words of David HaMelech in Psalm 47, Ola Elikim Besrua, Hashem, or judgment is elevated by virtue of the shofar blasts. That's for Rosh Chodesh Elul. It doesn't justify and explain why we sound the shofar all month long. But this pasuk, Im Yitokar Shofar Be'ir, does. And that brings me to today's subject. Focus matters. What is the focus of the sounding of the shofar? I have found, oftentimes, that people think of the shofar with dread. They point to this very verse. It's found in the 3rd chapter of the prophecies of Amos. In Pasuk Vav, Amos says, Im Yitokar Shofar Be'ir, and if a shofar would be sounded in the city, va'am lo yecharadu, would the people not tremble? As if to say, the shofar should make you tremble. We don't tremble in joy. We tremble in fear. So, is this about fear? Is Elul kind of a negative time? My experience has been that when people hear the sounds of the shofar, it does indeed strike some kind of fear into the heart, and oftentimes the connotation of the shofar sound is less than joyous. I'd like to suggest to you in episode 2 of Sweet and Low, Focus Matters, that our focus should not be on the negativity, but rather there's an extremely empowering and positive message that can be found in the sounding of the shofar. And this is how it goes. Firstly, let's look at that verse in Amos. Im yitaka shofar, and if the shofar will be sounded, va'am lo yecharadu, and the city won't tremble. To be sure, Amos in the 3rd chapter is speaking about the credibility of prophecy. In other words, we should take it seriously. He uses a number of different means to illustrate in rhetorical terms or with rhetorical questions and metaphoric terminology. In verse 6, after speaking about a bird falling into a trap and a lion roaring in the forest, he says, will the shofar be sounded in a city? But it's not just the sound of a shofar. In fact, it's the sound of a shofar as a warning. So this is what Rashi says. He says, Shahat sofa ro'eh gaisot. The sentry sees armies advancing and approaching. And therefore, from his vantage point, where he can see the armies coming from a distance, v'tokea b'shofar lahazer ta'am. So he sounds the shofar, in modern terminology, he sounds the bugle. And by blowing the horn, what he's basically telling the people is, danger is on the way. The Metzudas David is more graphic. He says, we speak here be'et milchama, in a time of war. War was hell. Horrible situation. If you were victorious, you paid a terrible price. Sometimes your victory was a Pyrrhic victory. And if you weren't victorious, people were sold into slavery. Rape was rampant. And was an enormous amount of wanton killing. War was terrible. And for the people in the city who were being attacked by troops or an army, the fear was unbelievable, for good reason. So if you're talking about a time of war, and you have a sentry whose job is to let the people know when the enemy is advancing, so he sounds the shofar, which is a euphemism. Of course the people are going to tremble. But it's not because of the shofar that people tremble. It's because there's a war coming. He sounded the signal or rang the alarm. It's not the shofar per se. Rabbi Yosef Karo in his commentary says that this is a metaphor for the concept of prophecy. He says, Ani misnava lechem ke'odam shotokea be'ir. And I'm giving you a prophecy, says Amos. What do you think, I'm playing games? If Hashem says he's not happy with us and he needs us to improve, it's not a joke. If it was a time of war, would you take the sound of that shofar seriously? Of course you would. You'd become very nervous. So too, he says, take the words of the prophet seriously. In other words, it isn't really the shofar per se. It's the metaphor of a specifically sounded shofar that brings people to the state of trembling or fear. Now, the truth is that we don't have to look at the shofar in a negative way. And we don't have to be despondent, demoralized, or fearful. The shofar should stir us, certainly. That would be a reasonable thing to say. But despite the fact that sounding the shofar should stir or wake us, as the Rambam famously says, the concept of fear and unhappiness, lack of buoyancy or inspiration, I'd like to suggest that that really is not in keeping with the spirit of Elul. And when people get into that kind of state during this month, they're making a big mistake. As we talked about in the previous episode, the month of Elul is a wonderful time, a time when Hashem is close to us, a time when Hashem expresses his love more freely. As the Rebbe used to say, quoting the Friedrich Rebbe, the metaphor of the king in the field means that everybody can and is perfectly allowed to approach the king during the month of Elul. Ah, the shofar. What message could the shofar bring us that nothing else can? So let's take a look at something the Gemara says about a kosher or a non-kosher kind of shofar. Let's see how this gets interpreted in halacha and understood in practical application. And then we'll conclude with a beautiful lesson, an ethical, moral, and inspirational teaching that the Rebbe gleans from this practical halacha. There's a Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. It's found in the Talmud Bavli on Daf Chav Zayin on page 27. It speaks about the kind of shofarot that aren't kosher. So the Mishnah says, shofar shenizdak, a shofar that's cracked, vidovku, or dibko, and it was glued together, pasul, a shofar like that is rendered unfit, disqualified. If you sound a shofar like that, you will not fulfill the mitzvah. Why? After all, it was a shofar, and it is a shofar. So it's split. You put it back together. Why would there be an issue? So Rashi says, the havale kishnei shofarot, because it's like two shofarot. Rashi doesn't really explain himself. And the truth is that the Tosfos has a very difficult time understanding the words of Rashi. The Tosfos, after quoting Rashi, asks a simple question. He says, if the shofar split or was in two pieces, it's not two shofarot, it's two pieces of a shofar. He says, Im haya mechuber mitzad achad, if it was still in some way together, so then it never split. If you're just repairing a break in the shofar, it never was two shofarot, it was still two shofarot. And im nechlak, if the shofar actually divided and split totally, so, hainu, that would mean, in other words, the dibek shivrei shofarot, that he would have glued together pieces of the shofar, well, in that case, it's not two shofarot, it's pieces of a shofar. Pieces of one shofar, actually. In other words, we can't call a half a shofar a shofar. We can call it a piece. It's at best a shofar shard. It's not a shofar. It's like in the laws of ritual purity and impurity, a keli, an artifact, a vessel, is able to become ritually defiled. It maintains or contains the concept of tumah. Once it breaks, the tumah no longer applies. Why? Well, let's make it simple. Bullion or raw metal doesn't become tummy. A fork or a knife does. Well, as long as it's a fork and a knife, or a cup and a plate. But if it's broken, it no longer is looked at as a fork and a knife. Rather, you see it as scrap metal. So if you sit down at the table and you need flatware, you don't say, pass me some of that scrap over there. You say, what scrap? You know, that scrap, the eating scrap. No, you'd say, pass me flatware. Pass me a fork and a knife. But if it was mangled and broken and no longer usable as a fork and a knife, indeed, it would be called scrap metal. A shofar is something that you can actually sound by virtue of blowing into the narrow sound. A split shofar is not a shofar anymore. If it would be ritually defiled, it would become tahor after it splits. I'm adding this explanation. The Tosfos does not, but the Tosfos says it's dibek shivrei shofrot, pieces of shofar. And therefore, the Tosfos says I have a very hard time with the Rashi's idea that this is actually two different shofarot. And so he wants to suggest that maybe what we're talking about here is a person who has a shofar, and then he glues additional pieces or additional part of a shofar on the other end. In that case, he says, you're actually talking about two separate shofarot that are being glued together. Rabbeinu Asher speaks about similar kind of question and issue, and he says, at the end of the day, the issue would be, clearly, if somebody would add pieces of a shofar to a pre-existing shofar. But he gives us a good idea of understanding the words of Rashi. He says, Dibek shever l'shever, la'orach ha-shofar, you added pieces of a shofar to the end of it, v'hakol yotze mishever l'shever. And so the sound of the shofar is passing from shard or piece of shofar to piece of shofar, ricocheting off the different pieces that have been glued together. V'shayich leposloi, and therefore it's reasonable to disqualify it, mishum shnayim ushlosha shofarot, by virtue of calling it two or three shofarot. Now it's very interesting that this halacha is actually quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. In the Shulchan Aruch it says simply, Divek shivrei shofarot ze im ze, if a person were to glue pieces of a shofar one to another, va'asa mehem shofar, and he made out of the pieces of a shofar, he made a shofar out of pieces, puzzle, it's not qualified. It's no good. in the Levush, which were halachic codes written very, very similar to the Shulchan Aruch, he says this is both in chapter Tovkuf Pevav 586 of Orach Chaim, and both actually in Seif Yud, in subsection 10. So he says, Dibek shiverush ofrot ze im ze, va'asa mehem shofar achad. He took pieces of different shofarot, and he glued them together to form a single shofar. Afilu yesh b'shever shekeneged piv shiur shofar. Even if the bottom half of the shofar is a completed shofar, and it has the amount of a shofar, he says, no good, puzzle. Why? The shofar echad amar Rachmana v'lo shnei shofarot. The Torah says one shofar, not two shofarot. Of course, the question of Tosfos is not really answered with the words of the Levush. It's not two shofarot, it's pieces of shofarot. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't mention anything, neither does the Mishnah. But the Taz, Magen David, says, shofar echad v'lo shnayim. The Torah says one shofar, not two. The Alter Rebbe, in fascinating, tiny nuance, gives us a tremendous appreciation of how to understand this. He says, in the same chapter, Tovkuf Pevav, chapter 586, and it's also Sif Yud, Dibek shivrei shofar zeh, a person glued pieces of a shofar together. Va'asa mehem shofar achad, shalem. The Alter Rebbe adds the word shalem. He says he made it one whole, intact, complete shofar. Puzzle. Why? Lefi she'ein zeh korei shofar. That's not called a shofar. It doesn't say it's two shofarot. It isn't. It's pieces of shofarot. He says that's not a shofar. And then he says, Va'afilu yesh b'shever shekeneged piv shiur shofar. The shofar has a certain amount that has to meet. Even if the part of the shofar that's raised to one's lips, from which one is blowing the shofar, it's complete, intact, not cracked at all. Afal pikein hu nifsal machmas hashvarim hanosafim. It will become disqualified by virtue of the additional pieces added to the shofar. And here we see the Alter Rebbe following the direction of the Rosh. Al shever zeh, because it becomes disqualified by virtue of these additional pieces. Why? Listen to the beautiful way the Alter Rebbe explains this. He doesn't say because it's two shofarot, although that's what the Levush says and the Taz says. They're just simply using Rashi's words. But here, using the phraseology and the logic and explanation of the Rosh, the Alter Rebbe creates this beautiful sentence which reveals and explains the jurisprudence. He says, Shehakol yotzei derech sham. That means even if the shofar I'm holding, the part of the shofar I'm raising to my lips is a shofar. It's a small shofar, and I wanted to make it a little longer, more impressive. So I'm gluing extra pieces on the outside. So he says, Hakol, the sound that's coming out of the shofar, is coming out the other end. And the other end is comprised of various shofar pieces. V'hatorah amra, and the Torah says, Alter Rebbe's language, Kol hayotzei mi shofar echad. He doesn't say the Torah says one shofar. He says the sound of one shofar. Kol, a sound hayotzei, the sound that is emitted by one shofar. V'lo hayotzei mishnei shofarot. Not a sound that is coming to us by virtue of multiple shofarot. In other words, the essence of the shofar is a simple, singular sound. The sound of wind passing through the world's oldest instrument. It's a natural whistle, the shofar. It's really very elemental, very simple. The shofar is hollow. You empty out the shofar. You drill a hole on the narrow side. Presto, you have the oldest world instrument the world has ever known. That sound has to come out of one shofar, not multiple shofarot. So the question of Tosfos falls to the side because the Alter Rebbe says it's not a question of two shofarot. It's really not the point. The point isn't how many shofarot we have, if we have one shofar or two shofarot. The point is that the sound is a simple sound, an unlettered sound, an inarticulate sound, a non-developed sound, a simple, singular sound, the sound coming out of a single shofar. So what difference does that really make? Okay, the Torah says so, so it is so. Is there any kind of special lesson we might learn from this? Well, here's what I'd like to share in this episode. There's a fascinating letter from the Rebbe that was authored in advance of Rosh Hashanah Tafshin Chav Gimel, 1962. The Rebbe laments the fact that in so many synagogues, the sermons will be about big issues. People speaking about the challenges that we might face on a global level. Social issues, Israel, anti-Semitism, or whatever else it is that rabbis oftentimes tend to speak about on Rosh Hashanah. And the Rebbe lamented the fact that we're squandering an extraordinary opportunity. Rosh Hashanah is a time of tremendous inspiration, he said. And that inspiration has to be harnessed. What happens invariably is that people feel stirred, inspired, moved, perhaps even uplifted. But it doesn't get translated into anything pragmatic or practicable. You're busy solving the world's problems. You're getting really high, but you forgot to bring it low. And as such, we actually missed the point of what Rosh Hashanah was designed to do for us. It was designed to make us better B'nai B'not Yisrael. It's designed to bring us closer to Hashem so that we might live and function as Hashem wants us to. The Rebbe said that ruling out the approach of speaking about the big stuff, but instead focusing on the details of your life and my life is something that we can learn or derive from the shofar itself. And that's because the shofar this is the embodiment of Rosh Hashanah. If there is anything most iconic of Rosh Hashanah, it isn't the apple or the honey. It would have to be the shofar. That's an actual mitzvah. So this is the mitzvah which is miyuchad, and it is chovat hayom. It's the mitzvah that's obligatory. When Rosh Hashanah comes, every Jew must hear the sound of the shofar. You should eat apples and honey, and you should be wishing each other a happy and sweet year, and you should be in shul, and you should be praying, but you must hear the sounding of the shofar. And what message does the shofar broadcast? It's not a symphony. It doesn't have a variety of sounds brought together in concert. It's a kli boded. It's a single instrument. And it's not particularly musical. Its sound is not especially beautiful. The shofar that we use is supposed to be a keren pshuta, a simple horn, the horn that comes from an animal. We say, kol hakolot ksherim b'shofar. All sounds are kosher when it comes to the shofar. The shofar teaches us that the attention that we have to give is to the single, the individual. Any sound coming from a shofar is kosher. But it's got to be coming from you. It's not about a village. It's not about a plurality of people. It's about you. One shofar. You and Hashem. That's the message of Rosh Hashanah. And the Rebbe said that is ultimately the takeaway from the shofar. That each and every one of us has to choose to live the kind of life that Hashem asks us to. And once we make the right choice, once we are able to uplift and transform ourselves, you can hope that something will radiate out. And ultimately, if people are better as individuals, our society will become a better place. But the essence of Rosh Hashanah isn't to speak about societal ills or cultural challenges. The essence of Rosh Hashanah is one person. You, me, each and every one of us. In the same way that we listen to the sound of a single shofar, the actions of a single person, not necessarily in concert with anybody else, make all the difference. And that's what Rosh Hashanah is about. The Rebbe points to the Kuntus HaAvodah, which was authored by the fifth Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab. He talks about, in the fifth chapter, people who get inspired and have contemplation about lofty things. And he says, all that contemplation is nice, but Iker HaAvodah b'Hatfilah, the primary focus, the focus that matters in prayer, is not the big picture, but the Hizbonenus derech prat, the contemplation that deals with the details. To deal with the details of how you can, should, and must make a difference. The Rebbe Rashab goes on to say, Kasher yosim ha'odom el libay, when a person takes to heart, shekol yiridosai ba'olam, the whole reason that you're here is b'chdei la'avedas Hashem, is so that you might serve Hashem, that you might discharge your mission and your purpose. And that's performed lamato, down below, right here, embodied in a terrestrial sense, beguf nefesh habamis, levarer ulezachech es hamides, starting with real changes within ourselves, that a person effectuate himself to become more compassionate, more sensitive, more refined, more motivated, more focused, to become a better person. And if a person isn't working on making his or herself better, what you come to here, to this world for? What's the purpose of your existence? That's why you were created. Otherwise, you could have been just like another animal. Animals eat and sleep and frolic. And if a person just lives his or her life eating, sleeping, drinking, having fun, and entertaining themselves, they're essentially living like animals. He continues on page 43, he says, the upshot of all this is the tachlis ha'aveda hu be'izbonnos b'derech prat, that the ultimate message of serving Hashem is to be found in the details. That we should stimulate and stir and awaken from within ourselves a sense of excitement, passion, and exuberance for Yiddishkeit, for holiness. We call that Ahavat Hashem, a love being attracted or drawn to things which are good and holy. That we should have a sense of awe and reverence. We should avoid things which are, in the Torah's view, unhealthy and unholy. That's really what this is about. So, Sweet and Low, episode 2, is my suggestion that when we hear the sound of the shofar, maybe not only on Rosh Hashanah, but all along the month of Elul, as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah, it's not about trembling, it's not about fear, and it's not about misery or unhappiness. It's about us remembering that we, as individuals, make all the difference. May I become better. May you become better. May each and every one of us fulfill our destiny, our mission, and our purpose. And as a result of our efforts in Avodas Hashem, on a pragmatic level, just trying to do something or a few things, but something or a few things that are within reach and real during this month of Elul, hopefully we will merit a wonderful new year that is very sweet, on the lowest possible rung, as we continue to hope and pray that as a result of our avodah during these dark and oftentimes very challenging days, we will merit Yemei Ha'or, the time of eternal joy and light with the coming of Mashiach. May that be b'mheira u'b'yameinu. Amen. If you like this, I'd appreciate it if you liked and shared and subscribed, because hopefully as we continue to get the word out, more people will listen, learn, and be inspired to live lives that are more meaningful and effective, more elevated, to earn bracha for our entire nation. And by virtue of Am Yisrael, the entire world will receive bracha, hatzlacha, and hopefully geula ha'amitas v'hashlema b'mheira u'b'yameinu amen. Thank you for joining.